Hello, everyone. My name's Lisa Gay. I'm the senior technical writer at Right Hand Robotics, based in the Boston area. My background is kind of bookended with hardware documentation. In my early career, I documented smart grid technology. Then I spent several years documenting software. And then just a couple of years ago, I returned to the hardware world to Right Hand Robotics, where I document automated piece picking systems for warehouses. I'm going to be going on the assumption that most of you are primarily software documentation writers, and that hardware is generally something you haven't had to deal with much, although I do know there are some of my fellow hardware documentation folks out there, so hello, everyone. The big thing that I think is interesting about documenting hardware is just how much physicality and physical space impacts your documentation approach. One of the things that's been interesting are the user conditions I've encountered. For example, sometimes my users have been in a noisy warehouse surrounded by conveyor belts that are making lots of noise around them and with lots of other equipment. Or in the case of smart grid technology, my users might be up a pole in a cherry picker while they install equipment in the middle of a thunderstorm. This physicality is, as you might imagine, makes documentation use rather different. One effect of it is that it makes the prevalence of printed documentation much more common. For example, yesterday, even for myself, I was trying to get up to date on standards I need to follow. So I was reading an ISO standard document. It is a PDF that was clearly made by scanning a printed document and turning it into a PDF. You can see the edges of like the photocopy style blur on the edges. And the conditions where our users use documentation are also often going to be enforcing printed documentation. For example, we've had situations with our customers at Right Hand Robotics where operators in a warehouse have no Wi-Fi, you can't carry a laptop around, there might not even be any cell phone signal, and they might ban the use of mobile devices in the warehouse. So they're obviously going to be relying on physical printouts of documentation. Safety is the #1 most important goal when documenting hardware. The risks that keep me up at night when I was in the software industry or the smart grid industry was the worry that an operator installing a piece of technology in the wires might get electrocuted if I wrote an instruction wrong. In a warehouse, the concern is what if someone's head gets bonked by a robot arm? And there are so many more possible things that could go wrong. Those safety warnings are the most critical thing that I write every day. That often comes from industry standards and various regulatory bodies that determine exactly what you need to say in order to try and keep people safe. There are very good reasons behind all of this. In practice, though, trying to follow the various compliance guidelines can feel fairly arbitrary. You also end up with a bit of conflicting expectations. If you've ever tried to read a piece of equipment hardware, such as for your washing machine, it doesn't necessarily read like a good piece of communication. But you also do want to try and match your user's expectations. Writing good technical documentation that communicates effectively can feel in opposition to the needs to conform with expectations of the industry. So you also have to deal with users sometimes having fundamentally different paradigms, and there can be a very challenging cultural shift. When I worked in smart grid technology, I was dealing with companies where their expectation is that they would install equipment and it would stay in place working for about 70 years. Trying to talk to them about a product where you have to explain that their hardware is going to be obsolete in less than 10 years, and they're going to have to push out software upgrades every 3 to 6 months, that was a real shift in perspective for them. So what I've learned from doing documentation in hardware space is that this is an opportunity for me to meet a much wider range of audiences than I ever met doing software. It's a really challenging space to work in, but it's been very satisfying to be able to touch what you're writing about. Thanks so much for listening.